Hey everyone, Mulligan here and welcome to the Dead Reckoning card review. For those new, Dead Reckoning is a brand new campaign released by Direwolf Digital for the Eternal card game. This time around there are 25 new cards you can earn in this campaign. Cards that get released as part of the campaign do not show up in the draft format, so I'll only be talking about the cards as far as their viability for ranked play. Let's get started. First card we'll be talking about is Boar. This is a 1 power spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. You kill an enemy attachment, you create and draw a copy of Boar, then discard it at the end of the turn. This is almost a strict upgrade to the card Ruin. I really like the effect of this card as the ceiling's pretty high, potentially wiping out every attachment your opponent has on board. The effect also gets around Aegis as long as you have 2 power open. As far as its floor, well, at worst it provides the same effect as Ruin. The one thing Ruin has going for it though is that it's a fast spell, which keeps Boar from truly being better in every aspect. Regardless, I can't see people running Ruin in their sideboard at this point, and I'm almost positive Boar will take over that spot for tournament players. I wouldn't run this on ladder though. It's just too risky since attachment removal can end up being a dead draw unless the card can provide some other utility like Caleb's Choice, for example. Next is Oni Dragonsmith. This is a 1 power 1/1 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. Your dragons cost 1 less, and this has Dragon Ally. It gets +2/+1 and quick draw. When I unlocked this during the campaign, I got super excited. I have this Skycrag mid-range brew that has some beefy dragons in it. So I've been testing this card out in that deck. So far the results haven't been great, but I've had this card played against me and lost to it. This becoming a 3/2 with quick draw when you play a dragon means it can brawl with other popular 1 and 2 drops and win every fight. Of course this won't happen until at least turn 3 though, when you can play Crimson Firemaw. I'm hoping this opens up a Skycrag mid-range variant featuring some Dragon Tribal stuff, either now or in the future. This might end up being a must-kill unit in that deck, if it becomes viable. The next card is Tripwire Grenadin, a 2 power 1/2 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. When this comes into play, you deal 1 damage, and when this dies, you deal 1 damage. Pretty decent Grenadin, and yet I still wrote this off when I saw it initially. I thought there was no reason for the standard Stonescar Grenadin's deck to play this card, and I still don't think it has a place there. However, there are a few Grenadin brews being tested that plan to win the game with Black Iron Manacles and mill effects, particularly with another card in this review that we'll talk about later. We'll have to see if those brews pan out into something competitive. If they don't though, I'm afraid this little guy will remain on the sidelines as I don't think it's quite good enough to see serious constructed play. Next is Memento Mori. This is a 4 power relic requiring 1 time influence to play. This has +1 maximum power, and when it comes into play, you gain Fire, Time, Justice, Primal, and Shadow influence, 1 apiece. Not too much to say on this one actually. The most obvious archetype this would fit in is the old Nick Detraction control decks. I've personally only ran into it once so far. I'm not quite as sold on this going into Strangers decks. It probably will since there are so few options in the game to get influence from multiple factions in 1 card, but I think this would only see play in slower Stranger decks, not the faster, more aggressive ones. This card is very specific to the decks I mentioned, and I doubt it sees play anywhere else. Up next is Venom Rider. This is a 4 power 3/3 unit requiring 2 time influence to play. It has Deadly in charge and an ultimate where you pay 5 and give Venom Rider -1/-1 to play a 1/1 Sandstrider with Deadly in killer. I think this has a lot of potential, and it seems like some players are writing this card off. And I think one reason is that the stat line is weak to a certain primal board wipe in this set that we'll talk about later on. But that doesn't mean this card is bad. Yeah, it dies to Torch as well, but the whole dies to removal argument isn't really a great argument. Otherwise a lot of stuff wouldn't be played. Venom Rider does give you some immediate value, even if it's not that impressive. If you can curve this into the turn 5 ultimate, that's a pretty insane swing. There's no actual unit in the game right now that has deadly and killer in its text. Until this point, Time has only had the ability to give a deadly unit killer via cards like Xenon Initiation or vice versa with Viper's Bite. Time finally has a solid backup 4-drop that can play sidekick to Sandstorm Titan and can be played in any Time deck. And no, Devoted Theurge was not that 4-drop in my opinion. I think this is a very good card. Up next is Bury the Past. This is a 6-power spell requiring 3-time influence to play. You put a unit or relic on the bottom of its owner's deck. This card just reminds me of Entomb from Hearthstone since they're so similar in what they do. This card is slightly worse, but from a design perspective, it fits the Time faction perfectly. Hard removal has never been Time's strong suit because that's not Time's identity. So to anyone hoping that Time gets hard removal comparable to something like Vanquish or Slay, it's not gonna happen. Not unless it's a multi-faction card with the other faction having that specialty like Shadow or Justice. This is basically what single faction quote-unquote hard removal in Time will be expected to look like. As far as constructed, I don't think this card's bad, but it's not exactly good either. It's playable. I'll just leave it at that. Up next is Ikaria, Valkyrie Captain. A 2-power 1/1 unit requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. She has Flying and Endurance. When you have 6 Justice Influence, she gets +3/+2. And she also has an ultimate where you pay 3 to play a Justice Sigil from your deck depleted. And each Valkyrie in your hand gets +1/+1. I've got quite a bit to say on this one, but let's just get this out of the way first. The baseline stats on this are awful. It's the main reason myself and many others immediately wrote this card off. Especially when compared to the first Ikaria card printed that's been metagame defining up to this point. But I am starting to come around to this card a little bit. This version of Ikaria will heavily depend on whether or not a Valkyrie tribal deck ends up being good. The most common scenario you'll get is dropping this down on turn 2 and going with the ultimate on turn 3 to get some value as fast as possible. Because if this dies before any of the text on it gets used, you feel pretty awful. The stat buff once you hit 6 Justice Influence is just the cherry on top in my opinion. Some have said this will have a place in mono Justice Valkyrie decks, but I think this might be a decent way to ramp into Inquisitor Mokto. This card in Argenport Valkyries could be a thing. The card quality for that deck still doesn't seem to be there, or for Valkyries in general, but we'll see how the meta unfolds and whether or not a good deck builder can come up with something. Up next is Honor the Fallen. This is a 4-power spell requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. You give one of your units the battle skills of each unit in your void. When I first looked at this card, I kind of just said, okay, whatever, and gave it a pass. I've personally never been a fan of these type of effects in this game, mainly because they've never been good. But this is probably the best card that's been printed so far that gives multiple battle skills. The more I think about the common scenarios where this card will be good, the more I like it. I could see this in more aggressive Huru decks and even Rakano decks since both tend to play units with multiple battle skills. Of course, the players that play those janky Hero of the People decks will find a way to run this card in them. Hero of the People. The ultimate trap card. Anyway, maybe this card ends up being good. It probably won't, but maybe. The next card is Inquisitor's Blade, a 4-power 3/1 weapon requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. This gives the wielder flying, and when the wielder dies, give Inquisitor's Blade Destiny and put it into the top 10 cards of your deck. I like this card. I think it's quite good. You're inclined to run resilient units with this so you can keep getting value off of it, but you're an aggro deck. You're doing that anyway. My fear is that it will be yet another 4-cost weapon that will get overlooked because people seem to always default to Hammer of Might in their aggro decks running Justice. I think this easily competes with Hammer of Might, and it isn't even the only 4-cost weapon that does. I just think Hammer of Might is pretty overrated when it comes to Justice aggro. Warcry 3 isn't good in everything, guys. Weapons that grant a way for your unit to get face damage and are good too. Sadly, I won't be surprised if this gets tossed in the bin of criminally underrated 4-cost weapons. It'd be nice if it wasn't though and actually saw a good amount of play. Up next is Ward Wielder, a 2-power 2/2 unit requiring 1 primal influence to play. This has +3/+3 while you have an Aegis. So initially I was testing this out in a Uhuru mid-range deck that I put on the shelf a while back. You need a lot of effects that grant face Aegis for this to be a 5/5 a decent amount of the time. I was personally running 7 or 8 of those effects, and I don't think that was enough, leading me to cut the card from the deck for the time being. I think anyone that runs this card needs to have at least 10 cards that grant face Aegis for this to be anywhere near consistent. Uhuru is the closest to providing that with cards like Cobalt Waystone, Island's Favor, and Protect, but when you start looking for other cards to provide it, you start finding stuff like Mistveiled Drake towards the bottom of the bin, which isn't necessarily a bad card, but it's never been great either. I think as a baseline 2/2 unit though, this faces competition from Tranquil Scholar and even Darkveil Agent, as much as I dislike both of those cards. Maybe Ward Wielder is still worth it, but it's a hard sell for me. Up next is Hailstorm, a 3-power spell requiring 2 primal influence to play. You deal 3 damage to each unit. Here it is, the primal board sweeper I alluded to earlier, the card that has been the talk of the town and has been making waves in the metagame so far. There's a lot to talk about regarding this card, so buckle up. A lot of people will say this is the best card in the whole set. While I don't disagree necessarily, I think there are some cards in Dead Reckoning that potentially give this a run for its money. Anyway, this is basically the equivalent to the Magic the Gathering card called Anger of the Gods. This will likely dethrone Lightning Storm as the go-to early game board sweeper for Primal. The problem with Lightning Storm is that it's extremely narrow, and only the lowest to the ground aggro decks like Stonescar or Rakano Rally were weak to the card. Any aggro deck with some amount of meat on their units could shrug off Lightning Storm. Decks like the normal Rakano aggro or Rakano Plate and Royal Burn all play units with 3 health in the first 3 turns of the game. Hailstorm deals with that. I initially thought that aggro decks going forward would need to run either Justice or Primal to have access to Aegis to get around this card. Others have said this will slow down Rakano significantly and will be the death knell of Stonescar, with only Skycrag aggro being able to survive since they have Aegis units. I've got to say, as far as Stonescar goes, I disagree. Stonescar will need to rethink the unit package they're running for sure, but they do have a few units that offer some counterplay to Hailstorm that have seen play in the past. A charge will also potentially be more important than ever, not just for Stonescar, but for aggro in general. Regardless, I do think this is a welcome addition to the metagame. This card is the reason why Primal is the winner in Dead Reckoning. Up next is Daraka Queensguard, a 6-power 7/7 unit requiring 3 primal influence to play. He has Overwhelm. When you play Island, she gets Aegis. And when he comes into play, you stun an enemy unit, and it stays stunned while you have Daraka. An overstated 6-drop that has the potential to be the sleeper hit of the set. People are finding some early success with this guy on their mid-range decks running Primal. iSprite wishes it had this stat line. A bunch of people are sold on this in Elysian mid-range in particular as just a big 7/7 with Overwhelm that can stun something to push damage through. Personally, I'm a fan of using all the text on a given card, so yes, I think this can find a home in Uhuru decks running Island Clan Mother. I won't touch on the original island and whether she would be good or not. But as far as a Legion, I still think Predatory Carnosaur is better than this guy, and mainly because he gives you that immediate value when needed and has a better chance of providing a 2-for-1. Duraka gives you immediate value too, but unlike Carnosaur, Duraka has to stay alive, and there's quite a bit of removal that hits him. In the long run, I could see Duraka end up being pretty niche to Huru though, so if Huru isn't in the meta, Duraka might not be either. For now though, he's been pretty insane. Up next is Rip Knife Assassin, a 2-power 2/2 unit requiring 1 Shadow Influence to play, and it has Deadly and Warcry. This was spoiled a while back, and even now I think this card is one of the hidden reasons why Argenport Instigator was nerfed. If he wasn't, this guy would clearly be inferior, and he still might be. Assassin is still a good card in its own right though. There's just a lot of competition at the 2-drop slot if you're looking to fit him in a typical 2-faction aggro or mid-range deck running Shadow. I think the one aggro deck this will most likely end up seeing play in is actually Feln aggro, believe it or not. A Feln can best take advantage of the Unseen tag, and while Warcry isn't a Feln specialty, most aggro decks these days don't focus on Warcry anyway. It's just a nice bonus to have. The only true competition is again Argenport Instigator. There's other 2-drops, but they've been less than stellar in the history of Feln aggro so far, and unlike most of them, Rip Knife Assassin just does what he does. The next card is Argenport Sewers, a 4-power relic requiring 3 Shadow Influence to play. When this comes into play, you summon Nightfall, and when you start your turn at night, you play 2 1/1 rats that can't block. At the end of your turn, if you have 3 or more rats, sacrifice Argenport Sewers. This card is weird. It took me a while to think about what deck would even want this card. Initially, people have said Stonescar Sacrifice decks, and I agree. One other deck I could see running this card is actually Dark Chalice. It provides tokens to buff with Chalice, and to a lesser extent makes Nightfall to draw additional cards. Speaking of Nightfall, Argenport Sewers comes at a pretty good spot on the curve as far as cards that trigger Nightfall. The only reasonable 4-cost card that does that is Dustwalker, and I guess to a much lesser extent Extinguish, so it at least has that going for it. But again, this card is weird. It will likely not see any constructed play, at least for the time being. The next card is In Cold Blood, a 4-power spell requiring 2 Shadow Influence to play. You kill an enemy unit. If it was Justice, the enemy player discards each copy from their hand and deck. They can't leave the void, and you lose all Justice influence. I have quite a bit to say because I have mixed feelings about this one. So when I saw this while streaming the campaign run, someone said people are either going to love or hate this card, and I have to agree. The player in me likes the discard portion of the effect, and the brewer in me even more so, because this is going to go into a couple of pet decks I have planned. The designer in me though is concerned about the fact that this is a Justice hate card. I understand that if this didn't have a specific faction attached to it, this card would be super pushed, since that means Argenport gets to run it. The Justice hate is specifically so Argenport can't run this card, which is the one good thing about it, since Argenport already has the best spot removal in the game. This allows Feln, Stonescar, and Xenan to catch up, if you will. But I hope this doesn't become a trend. I was never a fan of hate cards in Magic the Gathering, and I personally think cards that hate on an entire faction, color, or class is poor design. Eternal might play like Magic, but it doesn't have to be like Magic in every aspect. Also, Argenport midrange has been out of the meta for well over a month now, so I feel like this card is too little too late in that sense. Tavrod isn't running around bullying people anymore. Regardless, it's a good removal spell, and will replace Deathstrike in a few decks for the time being. As the meta changes, it will be relegated to a sideboard card and may even be out of the meta at times. This joins the group of spot removal cards that cycle in and out of the metagame depending on what's popular. It will never remain a true staple for most decks. Up next is Sandglass Sentinel, a 5-power 6/1 unit requiring 2 fire and 2 time influence to play. It has Reckless, it's invulnerable to damage, and when it comes into play, you exhaust Sandglass Juggernaut. It seems like a lot of people are writing this card off. When I first saw it, I honestly thought it had some potential. The 1 point of health isn't a weakness if you're invulnerable to damage. The thing that will ultimately keep this out of your generic Praxis mid-range deck is that they run a little card called Worldbearer Behemoth, which is still better than this by a large margin. This is multi-faction, so it's immune to Annihilate, on top of not being able to use stuff like Torch or Vara's Favor to kill it. But Silence just ruins this thing. Desert Marshal just eats this guy for breakfast. At least Behemoth is still a 6/7. This will only see play in Sentinel-focused decks as long as Behemoth is around, likely with Mysterium Orb, which this card seems to be made for. Up next is Sower of Descent, a 3-power 2/4 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 Justice influence to play. When you Warcry a unit or weapon, reduce its cost by that much. And this also has Valkyrie Ally, where this gains Warcry 2. This card looks really sweet. The defensive stat line is a bit strange for a Rakano card, but I welcome it because Rakano has never really had any good units with defensive stat lines. If this was a 3/3 though, people would easily play this in the current crop of Rakano decks we have now. This still might see play in aggro. Cost reduction baked into a unit designed to attack to get that cost reduction can be pretty insane in a tempo strategy. The Valkyrie Ally ability is just icing, but also welcomes, especially since Valkyrie Tribal desperately needs more cards to make it a thing. The only way this doesn't see play is if there's no home for it, because it's a pretty good card. The snowball potential is high. Maybe there's some mid-range Rakano deck that still wants Warcry. We'll see. The next card is Jaro, Amaran Ghostblade, a 2-power 2/3 unit requiring 1 time and 1 Justice influence to play. He has an ultimate where you pay 5 to double the strength and health of one of your units wielding a weapon. This guy looks cool and is being seen in Combray aggro. Combray aggro has always been an archetype, and they've even run cards like Vodakhan Staff in the past, which this is clearly designed to be played with. But Combray aggro has never been able to go all in on a pants style strategy. For those new, pants is a term for a deck built around playing units and equipping those units with weapons to make them better. Jaro enables this strategy for Combray. I'm excited for this card because it allows Combray aggro to have some variety and not just be built one way like it has until this point. Up next is Equivocate, a 2-power fast spell requiring 1 time and 1 primal influence to play. You put a unit into its owner's hand, then transform it into a random unit with the same cost. A cool card. I feel like it's better than Teleport in almost every way for Elysian, and Teleport was always a fringe card you sometimes saw on a sideboard for tournaments, at least in the set 1 metagame. Some people, myself included, have run Polymorph in Elysian midrange, and this has the potential to replace even that, just because this is a fast spell and only costs 2. It kind of deals with revenge units, Mokdo in particular, and can be a solid addition to a more tempo-focused Elysian deck. The problem is Elysian has always lacked quality early game units to really go for a tempo strategy, so this may sit on the sidelines until that happens because I don't see this going into any 3-faction build at all. There is also the possibility someone comes up with an actually viable Mind Link deck as well. I still hope that this card sticks around and constructed. Next card is Huru Pacifier, a 3-power 3/4 unit requiring 2 Justice and 1 primal influence to play. It has flying and overwhelm, and weapons can't be played. The other card that was the talk of the town when it got spoiled and still is. Now, this card is a perfect example of a card that has the right combination of keywords, abilities, and stat line. Overwhelm is the only thing that doesn't seem needed, but I'm not complaining. It's almost like they started with one aspect of the card and kept adding things that compensated for any weaknesses of the previous aspect. Let's just roleplay a bit and say they started with the 3-4 stat line with no other text. Okay, that beats a lot of units that are 3/3s or worse and survives Torch. But what if it gets double blocked? Okay, let's add flying so that happens a lot less. Oh, and it coincidentally beats up a lot of common 3-cost flyers 1v1 too. Okay, but relic weapons are a good way to deal with evasive or sticky units, and now it's a 3/4 flyer that dies to the most common relic weapon in the game. Alright, let's add the ability to prevent all weapons from being played. And let's just throw Overwhelm on top of it just because. If you guys can't tell yet, this card is insane and will be a staple for almost every Huru deck. The next card is Anointer of the Faithful, a 2-power 1/3 unit requiring 1 Justice and 1 Shadow Influence to play. Has lifesteal, and when Anointer comes into play, you give a Paladin in your hand Bond. When you play another Paladin, play a +1/+1 weapon on it. Originally, I wrote this card off. There's a lot of other 2-drops that Argenport would rather run in a standard aggro or mid-range deck. And in terms of a Paladin-focused deck, most of the Paladins aren't very good on their own. But I did face someone that had an Argenport deck focused on Paladins and lifesteal, the keyword that is most common between them. And if you have the right opener and curve out in the early game, this can snowball very quickly, especially if you have 2. But that's the problem. Often that won't happen, and while I don't think this card is bad anymore, there just isn't enough support for it yet. We need more good Paladin cards from future sets for this to see real play in Constructed. The next card is Pok Pok, Rockpacker. The 3-power 1/5 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 primal influence to play. This has Reckless and Bond, and when you bond Pok Pok, create and draw a snowball. I don't have too much to say on this since it feels similar to Anointer of the Faithful, except the Yeti tribe has more support to back this up than the Paladin tribe for Anointer. There's a very real possibility you can play this for free on turn 2, with the amount of high strength playable Yeti 2-drops we have. Initially, a lot of people thought this and Iceberg Warchief were meant to be played together, and they still might be, but I haven't seen anyone bothering to test these out at the ranks I play at. On its own, Pok Pok is just awful. Even if you can play him for free, without a buff from something like Wump or the already mentioned Warchief, a 1-strength Reckless unit is just not what you want to be trying to win the game with. I'd be shocked if this saw serious play in Constructed anytime soon. Now, the next card is Lethrai Skystrider, a 4-power 2/2 unit requiring 1 primal and 1 shadow influence to play. When Lethrai Skystrider attacks, your attacking elves get flying this turn. And this also has Elf Ally, where you draw a spell from the top 4 cards of your deck and you discard the rest. One of the more interesting cards from this set. There are certain tribal cards where their effects lock you into playing that tribe and you're forced to build a deck heavily emphasizing said tribe. This card is not one of them, in my opinion. I like Skystrider because the ability is flexible enough to where you don't have to play her in an elf deck. Despite that, this card will only get stronger as more playable elves get printed. It's possible she doesn't make an impact now, but there is one deck she might see play in as far as the current meta goes, and that's Felnscar Scream. Turn 3 Direwolf Beastcaller into this on turn 4 sounds pretty insane, and the deck runs a bevy of spells, so you're very likely to find one you need for the situation. It's also a deck that wants to discard cards since you're able to bring back units from the void anyway. Granted, both units have to survive to pull it off, but your deck is focused around bringing units back from the void. People might be inclined to compare this to Rindra, but I think Skystrider is a better fit in terms of Felnscar Scream. She supports the game plan better, while Rindra is just a good but pretty generic unit. Admittedly, he helps your aggro matchup though. If this doesn't get played now, I think it will in a future meta. Up next is Overwinder, a 3-power 2/4 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 Shadow Influence to play. When one of your Greninja hits the enemy player, each player discards the top 2 cards of their deck. Another interesting card that I alluded to earlier in this review. While I don't think it's quite as flexible as Lithrai Skystrider, I still think it's flexible enough to where you could theoretically build a deck with it that doesn't run other Greninjas. So far, that hasn't been the case, and players are taking the easier route by going full Greninja Tribal with this card, Black Iron Manacles, and a bunch of low-cost Greninja cards with Gear Cruncher and Solitude as the top end. That may be the best way to use this guy. We'll have to see. But I am very interested in building a slower Manacles control deck where Overwinder is not the focus at all. It's simply a role player that supports the Manacles game plan. It just seems like a big weakness of these Greninja mill decks is Overwinder simply being removed, but I could be wrong. The deck has several backup plans to win the game, though none of them are great or even good. I want to brew with this personally and go a different direction, but I'm also keeping an eye on the Greninja decks that have popped up. I'm not writing them off yet. It'll be interesting to see how things play out, and yes, I think Overwinder is a good card. And finally, we have Mitotic Wisp, a 2-power 0/3 unit requiring 1 time and 1 Shadow Influence to play. It has flying. Your Radiance costs 1 less while this is in play, and this has an ultimate where when 7 other units go to the void, draw a Radiant of your choice from your deck. This is a good card, in the same way that the previous 2 cards we looked at are good. Early on, some were saying the only Radiant worth pairing this with is Shadowlands Tyrant, but I think there's a few more applications to this card than meets the eye. This might sound crazy to some, but I think this could see play in a deck like Dark Chalice. Lumen Defender is the big reason to run this card in Dark Chalice. You play this, you buff it with Chalice, you get into a situation where you have to Hailstorm, sending enough units to the void to proc the surviving Mitotic Wisp, and you draw a Lumen Defender to stabilize on your next turn. And it's got synergy with Dream Snatcher as well. It is unfortunate that Steward of the Past got nerfed, now being relegated to sideboard material in tournament play. Otherwise, searching him out would be pretty insane. I think the ultimate happens more often than some might realize. The 7 units aren't limited to just your own. It's also interesting from a design standpoint because it potentially limits design space as far as what Radiance to create. Direwolf might be fine with this roadblock though, since not a lot of good Radiants have been printed so far anyway, and maybe they don't plan on making a lot of pushed Radiants. I also think this is yet another card that you don't necessarily put in a Radiant deck and just gets added into a deck that happens to be running another good Radiant, hence the Chalice example. That's it for the card review. For those that stuck around to the end, thanks so much for listening to my thoughts on the set. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If you did, feel free to like the video. If you want to check out more Eternal content from me, feel free to look around my channel. I've got some more content in the works, so if you don't want to miss future videos, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.